Well, there's a new Guy Gavriel K book out, so I'm gonna read it. Let's review Written on the Dark. Written on the Dark by Guy Gavriel K just came out in May of this year. It is an incredibly digestible book. Lengthwise, it is a hair under 300 pages, which for fantasy readers is basically a weekend, and comes from an author who has a huge pedigree. I love Guy Gavriel K, especially his standalones. I loved Lions of Alrasan and Song for Our Bone. I think those are two of the best fantasy standalones ever. I really liked Tigana, so of course I was going to pick this up, and I had pretty high expectations for this book, and it really met those expectations and did so in a surprising way. So I'm really excited to talk about this book here today. Like all of Guy Gavriel K's standalones, or at least the ones that I have read, this is a fantasy work that is inspired by real history, particularly European history. This particular one takes place in a sort of faux France called Fable. My French is not very good. I'm going to give it a try. My uncle speaks French, and his partner is French, and my cousin, therefore, is French, and so I should be better at French, and I am just not. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to try to respect the accent while also not being able to do it myself, and we'll see how that goes. In this pseudo-France, there is obviously a king, but there is also machinations of religion, which I really enjoyed in this book because the church is a huge part of it. There is sort of a Rome stand-in, Rhodesia, I think, or something like that. It's pretty kind of next to one another. But in this France, most especially, this is during taking inspiration, I guess, from the 100 Years' War between England and France, where both nations basically tried to conquer the other one, and neither one, spoiler alert, in the long history of that war, could ever fully conquer the other across the channel. There's lots of incredible stories around that tension, and some of them are taken to create this amazing story. Some of them I knew quite well right off the bat. There's a clear stand-in for Joan of Arc in this work, which is just great, full of religious and political symbolism and thematic importance, and also that character is just done really well, which is not surprising for GGK. As well as the Burgundy Knights. I think John the Fearless is the one that is most represented here in a character. So if you know your medieval history, you'll see some certain echoes of that here, but if you're not, you're still going to love this story. You're just going to get to have some good reading of Wikipedia pages when it's done, because Guy Gavriel K actually has a great, I don't know if it's an epilogue, but like, an author's note at the end where he talks about his inspiration. So a lot of good time on Wikipedia after you read this great book. But I think the overriding inspiration, and certainly for the main character, is François Villon, which I did not know that name before I read this book, but Guy Gavriel K mentioned it, and I went and looked him up. And he is a famous sort of rogue poet in Paris in the late 1400s. And Villon, his most famous phrase in his most famous poem is, and I'm going to see if I can get this right in the French and then I'll translate it, but "On sent les neiges d'antan," which means "where are the snows of yesterday," which is, in the broader scheme of the poem, this lament of the beauties of the past. Specifically in the poem, it is women, beautiful women of the past, but also as sort of a metaphor of the beauty of the past that fades away necessarily into living into the future. And Guy Gavriel K has really made this book, and using those tales and inspiration from those tales of our history, to weave a beautiful theme about living in light of death in this story, and it was phenomenally done. By the way, since we're talking about poems and snows, I want to share one of my favorite poems, which is a Langston Hughes poem, obviously hundreds of years after François Villon wrote his "Where Are the Snows of Yesterday." This is an excerpt from Langdon Hughes' poem "The Underground," which I find quite comforting in these terrible times, and hopefully you will as well. You'll see the motif is similar, so I thought this would be a good time to share it. "We are like those rivers that fill with the melted snow in spring and flood the land in all directions. Our spring will come. The pent-up snows of all the brutal years are melting beneath the rising sun of freedom. The rivers of the world will be flooded with strength, and you'll be washed away, you murderers of the people. You Nazis, fascists, headsmen, appeasers, liars, quislings, you'll be washed away, and the land will be fresh and clean again, denuded of the past, for time will give us our spring at last. I just love that, wanted to share that. Oftentimes to myself, I think our spring shall come at last. But let's get back to Written on the Dark. The main character is Thierry Villard, which again is a stand-in for this French poet. He is a tavern poet, meaning he goes into like bawdy common rooms and gives sort of terse, silly, sometimes dirty poems to entertain people throughout the city of Paris, where they're at. It's not called Paris, but in my head it was always Paris. What's the fictional name? Oran is the fictional name, but it's basically Paris, even in the descriptions. And Villard is liked by everybody, but also hated by people because of his poetry. And as often is the case in GGK books, art is a very big part of the world and the importance that art plays in shaping narratives. And so Villard certainly is part of that. But he also very quickly gets enmeshed into what kicks off the plot, which is a murder of a very famous duke within the city of Oran. And because of various circumstantial reasons that actually make sense, I really appreciate that Villard doesn't become like a great warrior or become an assassin or something. Oftentimes in fantasy, our main character is a stand-in for whatever the story needs at the moment. They become good at stuff or whatever else. Villard is always just a poet who has schooling, and so that makes him somewhat smart in the area that he's thrust into, but not always the start. But he gets connected very organically to these larger happenings, both in the court, in the nation, and sort of across the continent. This murder mystery, kind of a mystery, enmeshes him in the kingdom politics and eventually through all sorts of stories that happen in this nation. And that's kind of all I want to say about the plot, because I really enjoyed the unfolding nature and not really sure where the thrust of the story was going. And like I said in my opening, it is a thematic book first and foremost. So there is certainly connected tissue throughout the plot, but also the overarching thought is reflecting on living our life in the shadow of death. And not just our death, but everyone's death. And whether we emphasize the first part of that phrase, living, or the end of that sentence, the death. And the seemingly random machinations that can lead to a better standard of living, not just monetarily, but with relationships, with what opportunities you get in the world, or can tend towards tragedy and how we face that tragedy and how human all of this is in our experiences. And it's quite beautiful. GGK is a phenomenal writer. I love reading his books, but in this book in particular, he really takes a sort of bardic approach to writing, where he really uses the voice of the narrator to both shepherd you through the narrative, but also create this theme and create this feel around the story that I quite enjoy. I have one particular example I want to share with you, and that is on this page 176 of my book here, my edition. This is not a spoiler in any way, but I think this will show you what this book will be, and I mean that in a very high, praiseworthy sort of way. There are places in the world where important things have happened, personal ones, births, deaths, childhood discoveries, love found or lost, or events impacting the wider world of kings and countries. Sometimes these larger ones happen years or even centuries apart in the same place, if it survives. It is not really surprising that a smaller reception chamber in the hunting lodge of Gavriel, built for royalty and loved by generations of it, should be one such place. Decades after that day, in a time after the world had greatly changed, another king of Ferrières, the grandson of this one, will receive an emissary from the High Patriarch in Rhodesia. The emissary is a military leader, sharing military plans. A woman of no stature at all will be present in the room, so she happens to be part of the emissary's entourage. She will discover, because she is clever and alert, a spy from a hostile country, beneath the window, hidden among the flowers. For reasons of state, the spy will not be executed, but he is sent home, expelled from Ferrières, and his right hand is severed. On the way, he will die of the wound festering. It was not intended, but it happens. He is in no way central to the tale of that latter time, the conflicts that ensued not long after, but he had a family that mourns him, and his death speaks to a hard truth. You can die at the margins of a story as easily as at the center of it, or just be a glancing comment in another tale. And that's just, first of all, from a specific writing standpoint, the way that he brings you into that, right? Like, this is a place that is important in history. Things will happen here. He's not just describing the scene or the chateau as it appears. You know, it's blue and the wood carvings, you know, anything like that. It's actually from a actual narrator's point of view. And also you can see there the theme that is so central here, which is the accidents of history. That when we form a story, we forget the human element and how each of those people are real people who have their own lives and in their eyes are the main character. And that you can die on the peripheral of a story as much as in the center of the story is so wonderful. And consistently, and not too much, he doesn't press his thumb on the scale too much, but Guy Gavriel Kay consistently gives us these flashes of understanding that there are other things happening than just the tale that you are reading. And that's always the case in your life, my life, Guy Gavriel Kay's life, that there's a main story, but there's a ton of other stories that matter quite a bit and are valuable, even though they're not in our story. That's great. I read this book incredibly quickly. It flows so well, and at the end of the book, I just had this incredible light feeling in my chest, in my soul, of just like how optimistic this book is, with a theme that often is quite dour in the fantasy world. I mean, a lot of different works through the last couple decades has tried to make this point, like that small stories matter, or that in these large stories when we hear of like knights and emperors and kings, there's a lot of casualties down below. I mean, prominent examples, I think A Song of Ice and Fire is really trying to do that and does it really, really well. Other folks like the First Law Trilogy and Joe Abercrombie are also trying to do it, and not as successfully in my opinion. But all of those tales are generally quite dark because they want you to feel the hurt and the pain of common people and peasants who we don't normally hear about, or servants, or even the bad guys in the story and getting their side. And so I'm used to that being a strong message and done very well, but in some ways a little bit pessimistic or dark, certainly depending on the author. But Guy Gavriel Kay has that same idea, but doing it in like a positive way of recognizing the positive aspects of these smaller stories and happenstance and randomness that happen in the world, while also being very realistic. It's not a fairy tale about how these things come to pass. I just really like this book. Guy Gavriel Kay's Written on the Dark. Would so highly recommend that you pick this up. I am giving this a universal recommendation. Have you read Written on the Dark yet? Let me know your thoughts. If you are going to read him, please let me know in the comments, because I love to hear that someone watched a review and this made them put this book on the TBR or get it from the library. If you have read it, let's talk about it. First in, last out.